It's another Manly Monday, and this Manly Monday, we're talking about how bad are men and boys doing these days. And I think this is an important discussion to have because there's a lot of content that's come out recently that, well, is a combination of, I think, misinterpreting data, not necessarily intentionally to grift. I think that some people are getting understandably desperate. And so they want to make things seem like a crisis so people will pay attention. And it's led to some misrepresentations in data that, one, I don't think are good for men's mental health. The idea that men are failing or men are falling behind. I mean, we've talked about lately, can we stop telling men they need to catch up? But also, I think that misinterpreting the data, because there is so much resistance to stuff that helps men and boys. Any errors in interpreting the data are going to be used by people who don't want these programs. And I think there's enough reason to continue to do it without stretching it. So I have an article from the New York Times that I feel more comfortable using because some of the other videos I saw where it's like, that statistic's not right and that's not totally accurate and that's misleading. I think it was done with good intention, so I don't want to criticize anybody who's doing that. The New York Times, on the other hand, it's text, so, you know, you don't get the, do you know what she said about you kind of thing. Somebody who's a reporter and getting paid, you know, by the New York Times, that's different than a bunch of people just doing a podcast. Not that podcasts aren't very influential. It's just that's somebody having a conversation instead of people who are bound to some sort of journalistic ethics. And I mean, part of the reason I got into It's Not Therapy is precisely because mental health reporting tends to be poor, precisely for reasons like this. So we're going to help support this channel and then we're going to get into it, okay? Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it, coffee.com/LeannaK. You can help other men who are struggling. That it's very important. Okay, so I'm gonna switch over to, that's the wrong one. I'm gonna switch over here. I don't have my camera in the corner for this because I'm using a different setting, but this is an article from, I mean, it's the Upshot, so it's the New York Times, but not just a feeling. Data shows boys and young men are falling behind. Boys' educational achievement, mental health, and transitions to adulthood indicate that many are not thriving. Now, it's the falling behind comment that I find a problem. I don't think that helps. Now, first of all, it does say the outcomes for Black boys are worse. Growing up in poverty disproportionately hurts boys. The disproportionate, I wish they wouldn't compare, right? We know poverty is bad. We know Black boys, have a lot of unique challenges. And this is true of everything. This is true of women's issues. This is true of men's issues. This is true of, you know, LGBTQ, especially transgender issues. When you take the data with Black and Latino, or Latinx, if you prefer, Latin, I prefer. Anyway, oh my God, words, terms, but if you take Black and Latin people, the data gets significantly worse. And this is the problem with talking about men or talking about women. These are huge categories. Some men are doing just fine. Some are not. And you can't neatly categorize by, say, race or poverty level or LGBTQ. There are intersecting factors. And this idea that you can solve this problem without treating people as individuals is not so. Um, Now, when we look at, say, the dropout rate, okay, 86% boys graduating high school compared with 89% for girls. Now, they do find that boys are lagging behind in terms of their academic readiness all through school. And I mean, we know that boys emotionally mature on average later than girls. And I've never been a big proponent of things like pre-kindergarten precisely for this. I think if you make kids into little students too young, it's not necessarily good. But, you know, we get into this issue also of boys' mental health tends to be treated as behavior problems. And this article does get into that, so I don't want to get too far ahead. Now we get into this college enrollment thing. And I remember when women first outpaced men in college attendance back in the 90s. And it was, oh my God, freak out. This is the downfall of society. And yet it's still being treated as a new thing. Remember, this article is boys are falling behind. You can see this college attendance graph. Women outpaced men. Here's 1990, 1989. Okay. And there was a bit of a correction around 94, but women have been attending college at greater rates than men for 30 years, more than 30 years now. This is not a new problem. And of course they say that boys still outscore girls in math. And this is when the data gets messy and we start going, instead of, let's focus on girls, let's focus on boys. Like, depending on the data you cherry pick, you can make the case that girls are doing terribly. You know, they find 4 in 10 girls now have some sort of like diagnosed, fairly major mental health condition. Of course, then it's that, well, boys are underdiagnosed because their mental health condition is treated like a behavior problem. So, and this has a different statistic for mental health. So doing this, I have never been big on trying to use statistics to create a zero-sum game. An ideal education system has to have different methods for different students, so all types of students can do well. There's never going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and we need to stop trying for it. So you'll see, they're like, this article's like, mental health. You'll notice here, there is enough evidence to think that the educational system is not as boy-friendly as it could and should be. True, but it says above it, in education, this is more a story of the acceleration of girls. So, are boys falling behind? No. Girls just caught up. And heaven forbid, girls do better than boys. This is an issue. Someone is going to be slightly ahead of the other. Okay? It's a question of whether we think that 66% of women in college versus 57% of men in college, you know, is this a problem? Or is this because men are more likely to go into skilled trades, which are not college, right? That data's not here. And that's a problem. Because if men are just not getting anything, very different story, than men are going to become plumbers, carpenters, you know, insulation installers, all that, roofers, and women aren't. Women are going to get a BA. That's a very different landscape than if men are just not getting education, not getting employable skills at all. And it really is the employable skills issue. And I argue job security. And one of my hot takes lately is that the men's issues are really about shitty practices overall. And because men are still expected to be higher income earners, especially, among couples where they may not have maternity leave benefits. So if you don't work, you don't get paid. So men have to make more money because it's a single income household every time there's a kid, right? If there are not good labor practices that allow for things like paternity leave as well as maternity leave, sick days, proper vacation, full-time wage with job security, and the ability for wage growth. These are treated as business practices, corporate practices. But I really do believe that they are a huge part of the issues facing men right now. Because when men get into their 50s, they end up getting hit with ageism as well. And so right when their kids have hit college, now they're not making as much money as they used to. And that really messes with the identity of men. And I mean, we know there's a rate spike in suicides for men in that age block. And that has been persistent. A lot of these things people are treated as new things. They're not. These numbers have been sticky. So let's get into mental health, okay? Mental health has been worsening for young people in general and for boys in some different ways than girls. Among boys ages 3 to 17, 28% have a mental, emotional, behavior, or developmental problem compared to 23% of girls. If you heard the invisible record scratch there, it's the use of mental, emotional, behavioral, or developmental problem. Boys are more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls. And so the developmental problem, first of all, lumping that, neurodivergencies, into mental health, not great. It's not a mental health problem. Boys are more likely to be seen as behavior problems, but you're talking about a 5-point gap. But since girls are frequently underdiagnosed regarding autism because they're not acting out, it says right there, boys are roughly twice as likely as girls to be diagnosed with ADHD or autism, though experts caution that those may be underdiagnosed in girls for whom symptoms can show up differently. Twice as likely with only a 5-point spread. These numbers are about equivalent. There's about a quarter of kids that are not doing well, period. Okay? Mental health has also been declining for girls who are more likely than boys to have anxiety and depression. Researchers say that because boys still face the expectation to be stoic, their struggles more often show up in their behavior. Nearly 2/3 of teenagers say boys are more disruptive in class, while just 4% say girls are, based on a recent survey of teens. Now, the thing that I find about this is opinion. Pew Research is great for what do people think about things. It doesn't mean it's so. It doesn't actually mean that boys are more disruptive in school. There could be stereotypes at play here. We don't know. And it does say that other behaviors like physical fighting and drug use have decreased for boys. So there's some good here. This is the problem. It's so easy to pull these numbers apart. I don't know why they're taking this approach. Because if you look at this stuff, it's so easy to say, well, these numbers are misleading, and so boys really don't need help. And I'm like, bullshit. You've got something where 1 in 4 teens has some sort of mental health issue. That is far too high. Interestingly, 1 in 4 people is also not gender typical. So maybe it's this idea that they're weird or not normal or they don't fit in. I'd love to see some cross-referencing because we know, LGBTQ teens do less well. We know that, people who don't fit norms, who are very roughly corrected, tend to have more, mental health issues. So we can say, like, look, both boys and girls are struggling too much right now. Boys need different intervention methods than girls. We need to provide both. Because as long as we keep going, oh no, boys are falling behind, people can just pop the bubble of these iffy statistics, and then it's an excuse to not give boys additional supports. And again, these numbers have been what they are since the Second Bloody World War, at least. You saw the thing about college attendance, the 1990s. It's worse that this is not a new problem, because the minute something hits 3 generations, it gets even harder to solve, and we're there right now. We've got to do something to correct these trends to benefit everyone. And if we're pitting men and women against each other, and blacks and whites against each other, and gay and straight against each other, this is a reason to not fund. This is a reason to not do more. And there's reasons to do more, right? Now we talk about 84% have at least one friend, 80% of boys, one friend they can lean on for emotional support. That's pretty good. 95% of girls who say they do. Okay, these numbers are both quite high. Obviously, loneliness is something of an issue. I wonder if, boys being diagnosed with autism more may have something to do with this. Not because autistic people can't make friends, because people treat autistic people like they're weird. And there are serious issues with the way the US government is talking about autistic people right now. That's something we can solve. But then we get into the suicide thing, okay? Suicide is more prevalent among men than women and has increased among young people, but the increases are far greater for young men. In 2023, the suicide rate for males ages 15 to 24 was 21 per 100,000 people, up from 11 in 1968. That's quite an increase. It's doubled. The suicide rate for young women was 5 per 100,000, up from 3. The thing about this is women attempt more. It's the method of the attempt. And this is grisly, but the way women attempt suicide, it tends to be like overdoses, right? Which means you have time to intervene. With men, it's more likely to be things like guns, and that you can't. So it's not a question of attempts. It's a question of completed suicides. And this is not trying to minimize the problem. This is just being honest about the problem. We see the mental health numbers. They're on par. Now, going from... The thing I don't like about this article is it takes some data from the 90s. It takes some data from the 60s. There's a lot, if you went back and looked at the suicide rate in, say, the 30s, that was the Depression. Gee, economics and suicide, they correlate. They correlate. People need the dignity of a job that they can live decently on, period, end of story. And this, they go... more prevalent among men than women, and then they only give the youth statistics regarding suicide. And I got to be careful talking about this too much because YouTube flags it. I hate that. The rates, again, consistently, the people at most risk of suicide are men in their 50 to 64. We know this. And the lack of focus on this is glaring. People don't want to talk about it. And again, there's economic realities as well as the fact that men start feeling less useful around that age. In part because they're not making as much money. They're not, they're not as strong and as active. Some are, but they're not, aging is rough. Especially on the internet now, where people are fucking cruel. But there's no life stage with dignity that people can feel like they're still contributing now because of this hyper competitive bullshit that is everywhere. A certain amount of competition is healthy. Don't get me wrong. But the zero sum shit is not. And then, back on economics, we get into transition to adulthood. Though young people in general are taking longer to reach the traditional milestones of adulthood, it's particularly true of young men. Among men ages 25 to 34, 19% still live with their parents, up from 14% in 1983. Okay, a 5% increase is not that big a deal, seeing as people are in school longer and people are getting married a bit later. Of women that age, 13% live with their parents, up from 11% 4 decades ago. Is this an increase? Sure. Is it a super startling one? Not really. Things are more expensive. School lasts longer. Not that odd, right? While women and men used to be equally likely to be single, less than a third of those ages 25 to 54 were in 1990. So that's 33%. Okay, so we'll say 30%. Less than a third. Now, 39% of men and 36% of women don't have a partner. A Pew analysis of census data found. The mismatch may be because women often partner with older men. That's interesting. Again, a 3% gap is not huge. And talk about, manual labor has disappeared from the United States while women dominate service-oriented work. That pays like shit. 2, they've just said that AI is most likely to disrupt those service-oriented jobs that women do. So, yay, the numbers are going to get worse for women, which means men are going to be doing better comparatively. This is not what we want. And this is the problem with going, are men doing worse? Are women doing worse? No, we want the high tide raises all boats phenomenon, right? We want more people doing better everywhere. And the stuff about labor force participation, this is a major pillar of this article that shows men's labor force participation has declined. Okay, technically that's true, but that's pretty flat. Okay? Going from 94% in 1975, which, let's face it, was right before things went to shit. With, that was stagflation was coming, right? Yeah. 94% down to 89%. Men's workforce participation is still a full 11 points higher than women's, right? Why is this raising the alarm? I mean, we know the job market's shit. And then, while women still earn less than men, their median weekly earnings have climbed 19% since 2000, while men's have increased just 7% in that period. Judging by the number of women in college, if more women are in college than men, and they're still making less money, what the fuck is going on? And then you get this quote, the contemporary American economy is not rewarding a lot of the characteristics associated with men and masculinity. That's not true. We know that men are overrepresented in the top percentiles and men are overrepresented in the bottom percentiles while women are overrepresented in the middle. So the problem is not that it's not rewarding a lot of the characteristics associated with metamasculinity. It's rewarding very strongly a few for their aggression and dominance and being competitive. But there have to be, in the words of immortal Ace Ventura, a loser. So some men win big at the expense of some men who lose big. And we have to decide whether, again, this zero sum is better for society than a model where men are more represented more evenly instead of dominating at the top and the bottom. That's a more nuanced discussion that we can have. That's what the data looks at. But that's not what this article says. And the problem with this stuff is we end up arguing the opinions in the articles, right? I watched another podcast where they opened by saying, women have risen more rapidly than any other people in history, which is a good thing. And I appreciate them saying which is a good thing, but it's not true. LGBTQ rights have moved incredibly rapidly, which is why there's such a huge backlash. Women did have further to go, but first wave feminism happened back in the early 1900s. And we're still having this bullshit, right? And yes, there's more to do with LGBTQ rights. There have been massive setbacks, partially because the activist classes have been fucking up. But this idea that women's rights have advanced faster than any other group in history is just not true. And my argument here is we don't have to do this. This is using the toxic elements of men being encouraged to compete to try to make a case that falters on this idea that people have to have it worse than anybody else to matter enough to create change. And I think that's bad logic. Any change that is relatively simple to do and benefits anybody, we can do something about that. Therefore, let's do it. We do have to talk about nurturing men and boys more. And we do have to talk about the bullshit labor practices in the US, and Canada gets infected by it as well. We need to talk about that stuff. We can do something about that stuff. Better labor laws, men will do better. Working on ageism. Ageism is a huge thing that affects men, that isn't factored into men because men are still treated as the default by society. So we don't talk about ageism for men because it affects men differently than women. And differently doesn't mean better or worse. And differently doesn't mean, you don't need the help. And this is the problem, because the stereotypes associated with men are all, you should take care of yourself and protect the women's who need protection. The idea that men can stand on their own and women can't is part of the problem here. The social stereotypes of, women's need the help. Women's need the protection. Poor little women's never stand on their own, always need protect. Let's tell that 11-year-old kid, look after your mother. As if that's not gonna fuck that child up, thinking they have to look after a grown-ass adult just because she's a woman. This is bullshit. Protect her from what? What's an 11-year-old gonna do against an intruder? Fuck. And those attitudes that women are perpetual children and men sort of hit this point, allegedly, in development where now you're on your own, life is hard, don't expect anyone to support you, that's a problem. And the the issue is that we think this stuff is natural. And we start going on about the role of testosterone and aggression and all this shit. There are some pretty aggressive women out there, let me tell you. But if we go, okay, men being aggressive is normal, then the men who aren't aggressive are seen as abnormal. Even though we say, oh no, that's better. It's abnormal. And especially in cultures like the US, where it's such a melting pot and normal is such a strong cultural force. Not being normal, it doesn't matter if it's, oh no, it's kind of good. Abnormal makes people feel intensely threatened. And okay, there are some European cultures that have really strong norms that way. Because we're a more multicultural society in Canada, we have a little less of this, but it is getting worse. And I don't think these culture wars are helping anybody. If, we'd expect to have seen some upticks during the Trump years. We're gonna ruin DEI, we're gonna get rid of DEI. If that really helped men, we wouldn't have been seeing these declines, because DEI, affirmative action, DEI, all that stuff, it's a steady curve. It's not, oh, they put in affirmative action, big dip. Oh, they put in more DEI, big dip. You saw the curve. It's steady. And there's a psychological element to it. As long as men believe that DEI means you don't count, that's a failure of those inclusion programs. The reason inclusion is there is precisely because it doesn't matter if you have a diverse workforce if there are people in the margins and people in the center. You've got to bring everyone in. Now, the unfortunate fact is, because of historical inequalities, there's going to be this perceived loss for men, while everybody else seems to be gaining. Again, Black men are not sharing in these gains, and Black men are men, right? One of the big things you don't hear about with LGBTQ activism is that the benefits for LGBTQ people gay men do so much better. Gay white men do so much better than everyone else under that umbrella. Black people still do shit. Latinos still don't do as well. Asians up there with whites. There are reasons for this stuff, and part of it is cultural stereotypes, part of it is cycles of poverty, and being a poor immigrant is not the same as being fourth or fifth generational poverty. Intergenerational poverty is a huge problem. Ask the UK right now. And how do we solve these problems? We don't solve these problems by being at each other's throats. We solve these problems by creating a culture, by creating a system that is needs of the individual based. There have to be some standards, but they don't have to be this rigid. It's going to take a while to change the opinion that boys benefit from harsh discipline. We know they don't. Standards, yes. Structure, boys very much thrive on structure. Girls do too, but we find, more benefits for boys. But it's got to be a combination of, look, you did something wrong. There need to be consequences for that. But let's talk about why you did it. What's going on with you? You can say actions have consequences and still make that young man feel like he matters and someone cares about his feelings. And I do think there's a bit of emotions theater going on with girls, but that's a discussion for another time. Girl bullying is not as well understood. Ask a lot of guys who were bullied by women. And the acting out, girls act out in different ways that the education system doesn't pick up on. We know this. I have a book from the 90s called Odd Girl Out by Rachel Simmons. It talks about this, that the way girls act out is treated as invisible by the educational system. And these stereotypes, this boys will be boys stuff, we think it advantages boys. We think it privileges boys because boys are allowed to quote unquote get away with more. But does it really? Because that creates this self-destructive standard that all boys feel like they need to live up to. And I was very happy to see an article, but I think his name's Joseph Quinn, the guy playing Johnny Storm in the upcoming Fantastic Four movie, which I am super stoked for. But he said that, womanizing men who treat people poorly aren't sexy anymore. And that is a huge thing coming from an MCU actor. Because, under the Whedon years, it was Iron Man going, I invoke the right of prima nocte, and Star-Lord forgetting the woman he had a hookup with in the cargo hold. This is the shift that we need. We need to give boys a healthy, centered, masculine self-image that isn't based on hurting themselves or other people. It isn't based on emotional callousness. It isn't based on you have to be the best or you're nothing. That is the way through. That is the way to solve this crisis that is happening regarding mental health for everyone. Let's face it. But, boys as well. And hate to break it to you people who dating proves society includes, society favors women. Those numbers, I'll read them again. I'll scroll down about partners. It isn't the gloom town that people are claiming. 39% of men, 36% of women don't have a partner up between ages 25 to 54. Now we know that the dating statistics for Gen Z, before that 25-year-old thing, those numbers are going to start changing once Gen Z gets into the mix. But, the numbers aren't that different. They're just not. And believing it's doom out there doesn't help you. There's a healthy approach to challenge. I spent my entire life going, yeah, I'm not normal. Yeah, I knew that as a game journalist, I couldn't make any mistakes. I had to be 5 times as good as any guy there. Well, guys were copying the answers to the questions I asked. I couldn't complain about it. I could never lose my temper. I knew I was always going to be the back of the line. I was going to be the one that reviewed all the games that nobody else wanted. Because the guys always got first pick. Because they were the real gamers, of course. Now, that allowed me to be the one that reviewed Assassin's Creed Rogue. And man, that was a good game, right? But did I go, I can't do it, so I'm not going to bother trying? I did sometimes. I didn't apply. After my applications just got rejected instantly by the big sites that were writing all this articles about including women, when they got rejected immediately, I was like, you know what? There's no point in applying to these anymore. They just want to hire their friends who look exactly right like them. I'd look up and see who the new hire was. It was always a white man who didn't have the experience or the knowledge that I did. But they usually post the job knowing who they want to hire. And this is just the reality of stereotypes in fields. I don't believe it's gotten any better. Ubisoft turned me down because I was too old. I had too much experience to enter their incubator program. But they wanted young. They wanted young women. They wanted women fresh out of school, not women with any transferable experience from other industries. Sucks to be me. But am I going to go, well, men shouldn't have jobs. No. It's just shit. This competitive shit is shit. It's zero sum. There are hundreds of people applying for every position. The thing that pissed me off is I paid $200 to join Women in Film and Television to explore that program. I wish somebody had told me beforehand, no, you're too old. Forget EA. Dog shit. Activision, dog shit. But are we going to look at gaming and go, oh, that's every industry? Of course not. So there are labor practices. There are education practices, broad strokes that need fixing. And these inequalities are indicators of that. That is not an equality of outcome argument. That is an argument of, look, these numbers, you notice in everything I did, the gap, if it was like a 10% gap as opposed to a 3% gap, then I went, okay, this is statistically significant. Nothing is going to be complete parity. Never. But if there's this huge gulf of like 10, 11 points when the population's 50-50, well, yeah, there's something going on here. Because in education, we should see less of a divergence. Again, that thing about education, does that include skilled traits? I don't think so, which would explain the deficit. But I don't know. And that's the thing with statistics. Whenever you look at the stuff, you have to look at what's not there as well as what is. And, the mental health issues, well, they include neurodivergencies. Double. Men are twice as likely to be diagnosed with autism. Why do they do this? Please give us apples to apples numbers. Please give us granular stuff. Because if there is a problem, yeah, we need to see it. But lumping everything in this way to get the outcomes you want doesn't solve anything because people like me see through it. And I'm somebody who does believe we need to put more investment into more flexible programs so different type of learners can learn. If a kid has to run around during the day to be able to focus, cutting gym is leaving that kid behind. And there's going to be greater problems as education departments get cut, as the Department of Education in the U.S. continues to get gutted. Because these charter schools are all about nose to the grindstone, traditional reading, writing, arithmetic, right? Sit and stay still. Unless you go to something like Montessori, right? But these kids who now there's school choice and there's belief boys need discipline, well, they're going to do even worse under those systems. We need to effectively diagnose the problem so we can create the correct solutions. Not this bullshit, but we can't wait for more data. We've got to start acting now. There's no reason to prove there is this crisis with men instead of what we're seeing, which is things not improving, things improving for women, but not improving for men. And if anything, there are subtle declines. This is enough of a reason to go, we need to correct, because it's not benefiting all women equally either. Black women are still getting fucked. There's things we need to do. Interest convergence. It doesn't have to be, oh, women have to have less so men can have more. It doesn't have to be men have to have less so women can have more. We can find things that benefit everybody. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/Leanna K. Or buy a one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. Thanks for watching. Manly Mondays.